Have you ever considered that 80,000 intact, fully equipped soldiers could surrender to an invading force riding on bicycles? This document completely shifts the perspective on the fall of Singapore. Welcome to Strategic Labs. Like and subscribe for more strategic insights. Today, we're applying our clinical lens to excerpts from Edward H Whitmore's British military failures. We're dissecting one of the most shocking operational collapses in modern history, focusing heavily on three massively disruptive points of failure. Let's get right into it.
So, here is our briefing agenda. 1. The myth of Singapore. 2. Error 1. Static defense. 3. Error 2. Tactical mobility. 4. Error 3. Psychological collapse. 5. Percival's surrender. And finally, 6. Our Strategic Labs lessons.
Section 1. The myth of Singapore.
To understand this massive collapse, we really have to wrap our heads around the illusion that came right before it. Before 1942, Singapore was literally touted as the impenetrable fortress of the British Empire. This wasn't just some catchy nickname, it was a foundational, ironclad strategic belief. They poured millions of pounds into making it this ultimate maritime shield. The expectation? A massive naval siege where any sea attack would be completely crushed by Royal Navy battleships. But the reality? Wow. The reality was a rapid, overland jungle assault. The Japanese entirely ignored the sea approach and just tore down the Malayan Peninsula. It was a devastating misalignment of operational realities right from day one.
Which brings us to Section 2, and our first truly disruptive point of failure. Error 1. Static defense.
So what went wrong here? Well, British Command severely misallocated their resources by adopting a highly rigid static defense posture. Basically, they poured world-class engineering and vast amounts of capital into heavy coastal batteries. Think massive artillery guns pointing aggressively out toward the Southern Ocean, just waiting for an enemy fleet that, well, never showed up. Because they focused entirely on the water, they inherently lacked flexibility. They completely underestimated the dense Malayan jungle to the north, arrogantly assuming that terrain was a natural, impassable barrier to any modern mechanized army.
When you break down the anatomy of this imperial hubris, you start to see these compounding failures stacking up. First, there was an absolute over-reliance on naval supremacy in the Pacific theater. They just blatantly ignored the threat of overland amphibious landings. But most fatally, they rigidly adhered to outdated models of European trench warfare. Instead of integrating modern combined arms, that fluid coordination of infantry, tanks, and air support working together, they prepped for a slow, linear, static siege. They were completely blinded by their own inflexible doctrine.
This rigid mindset segues perfectly into our second disruptive point, Section 3, Error 2, Tactical Mobility.
This is where Japanese operational momentum just shatters British expectations. Let's track the steps. 1. They easily infiltrate that supposedly impassable Malayan jungle, light and fast. 2. This is where their tactical agility really shines. Bicycle infantry, bicycles, over sweltering, incredibly difficult terrain where heavy British transport vehicles just bogged down in the mud. Thousands of Japanese soldiers silently pedaled down narrow plantation paths. 3. Instead of smashing into heavily fortified British strongpoints, they just flowed right around them like water, bypassing the resistance entirely. And 4. They'd pop up behind enemy lines and instantly sever British supply and communication routes.
The takeaway here is absolutely clear. Speed and adaptability will shatter rigid doctrine every single time. The Japanese forces achieved local superiority not just with raw firepower, but through sheer, relentless maneuverability. They moved with such speed that it created intense psychological terror, basically operating entirely inside the British decision-making loop. Before command could even figure out what was happening in one sector, the Japanese had already flanked them and moved on to the next.
Which triggers our final and arguably most fatal point of failure. Section 4. Error 3. Psychological collapse. Just trace this blistering timeline. You have the rapid advance down the peninsula, right? Quickly followed by a completely daring crossing of the Johor Strait straight into Singapore itself using improvised assault craft. They instantly cut whatever supply lines were left, totally isolating defending units all over the island. You see, in warfare, when comms break down and your units are in the dark, you don't just lose physical ground, you lose the mind of the commander. The sheer velocity of these tactical failures induced a massive systemic command paralysis. The British literally had zero time to process incoming intelligence, let alone mount a coordinated counteroffensive.
And that total paralysis brings us to the climax, Section 5, Percival's surrender on February 15, 1942.
80,000. Let that sink in for a second. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival authorized the capitulation of roughly 80,000 British, Indian, Australian, and local troops. And honestly, the most shocking part of this whole event is that these forces were largely physically intact. There was no massive, annihilating final battle that wiped them out. That staggering number represents a surrender born entirely out of total logistical and psychological collapse, not sheer military destruction.
If we look objectively at the grim calculus behind that decision, it's a strategic failure in preparedness, not just a bad day on the battlefield. Logistically, the defenders were starving, facing critical shortages of food, clean water, and ammo. At the command level, the defensive network was entirely fragmented with zero comms between sectors. And on a humanitarian level, remember, Singapore was a highly dense urban zone. Military leadership was terrified of catastrophic civilian casualties and a complete breakdown of military discipline if bloody urban combat continued in all that chaos. Surrender just became the only logical conclusion to a fundamentally broken system.
So, what can the modern strategist actually learn from all this? Let's hit Section 6, Strategic Labs Lessons.
The source material synthesizes the core lesson perfectly. It calls this a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency and rigid doctrine in a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. The fall of Singapore proves, without a doubt, that massive fortifications, historical prestige, and even vastly superior numbers mean absolutely nothing if your underlying assumptions about your enemy are flawed. Institutional hubris completely blinded British military planners to the evolving, fast-paced character of modern warfare.
The geopolitical aftermath of this was immediate, and it was devastating. The long-held illusion of British invincibility was permanently dismantled on the global stage. We're not just talking about a lost island or a minor tactical setback here. This was a global shockwave. It shattered imperial prestige across Asia, massively emboldened further Japanese advances, and forever changed the strategic balance of power in the Pacific. It proved once and for all that agility could conquer armor.
Which leaves us with an absolutely critical question for your own operational planning. Are your strategic assumptions blinding you to unconventional threats? Are you busy preparing for a massive naval siege while the enemy is quietly riding bicycles through the jungle right behind you? This is just a preview. For the full deep dive, check out our long-form podcast on the channel. See you in the next one.